Happy to introduce David Hawes from Net Zero International. And we're going to be talking today about a CEO's guide to carbon footprinting. So all things carbon. So, David, we've worked with you, what, 5 years now? Something like that?
Yes, yeah, it has been.
Yeah,
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 incredible,
yeah,
isn't it?
yeah. Time's ticking on. Yeah.
It is indeed.
All things carbon. So, from a CEO's perspective, what is carbon footprinting and why does it matter for bottom line? That's a big question to kick us off.
Okay, so yeah, so great to be here, Nick. Great to meet you as always. So yeah, so carbon footprinting is understanding the emissions that your business has within its operation. There are various ways of measuring that in different scopes, from technical elements of it. But from a CEO perspective, an organization point of view, it's increasingly becoming important for a couple of reasons. The main one is being driven by sort of regulation and legislation around carbon becoming a mandatory reporting line for especially larger organizations. So very large businesses have to. And part of a very large business's emissions is part of through its supply chain, what it buys from other companies. So if you are a supplier to a larger business, your customer is increasingly going to be asking you to provide them with their carbon footprint. So that's the way they measure it. And if you look at, for example, the NHS, it's probably the best known example of that at the moment. You cannot get on an NHS framework if you don't have a carbon footprint. So all of a sudden, it's becoming a sort of a necessity from a market perspective in that space. But also, if you want to attract people, we're seeing more and more people want to, especially younger people, sort of graduates, want to work for companies that are taking not just carbon but sustainability, and as you well know, more broadly importantly, if you want to get funding, so a number of investments will now require a carbon reduction plan. We're seeing some local councils will only offer grants if you've got a carbon reduction plan. So there's a number of factors that are making it, increasingly not only a mandatory, but also you have to really be able to make your business work in the future.
Yeah, definitely in that tendering space people have been in. We should differentiate actually. So carbon footprint is measuring it, but then carbon reduction plan is sort of moving on, isn't it? Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the old adage, isn't it? You can't measure you can't manage what you can't measure. So carbon footprinting is the measurement element. So it's okay, we have these emissions, we have a fleet of vehicles, we have buildings that use gas, electricity. You measure all of that and you work out what your emissions are. And then you set a commitment to get to net zero in line with, UK sort of requirements. So 2050 or 2045 is NHS. And then to be able to get to net zero, you set up a carbon reduction plan to say these are the actions that we are going to take that will start to reduce our emissions. And that may be that we're going to invest in, sort of solar panels. It may be that we're going to switch to LED lights to reduce. It may be that we're going to create a sustainable travel policy to encourage cars. There's hundreds of different things as you can imagine. I think the big thing to take away from that, Nick, as well, is that this isn't one of those things that you're going to do in 3 or 4 years. This is a long-term plan, 20, 25 years, which is quite unusual. Most
Mm.
organizations don't have business plans that are 3 to 5 years, let alone 20 years necessarily. So it's quite different to BAU. And I think that's really the key, again, another key takeaway when we talk to boards and teams is that this is about creating activity that may not have a benefit for a couple of years, but you can start to make your business culturally work around being a lower carbon business. So it's a culture of carbon footprint rather than necessarily a compliance ticking a box because we have to. And you know that very well because of everything you do in the broad sustainability and trying to embed that as well.
Yeah. Just touching on regs, you mentioned it, and the thresholds. So in terms of the audience, we've got a mix of people here, but I mean, big ones, SECR, ESOS. Do you just want to touch on the major things in play and what sort of thresholds apply?
Yeah, so SECR is streamlined energy and carbon reporting for any company to have to report through SECR, you have to have two of these following three criteria. So either more than 250 staff, more than 36 million pounds turnover, or 18 million on the balance sheet. So if you have two of those three things, you mandatorily have to report your carbon as part of your financial accounting. So, within your financial accounts and then uploaded to company's house and stuff like that. And you have to report your scope 1 and 2 and certain elements of scope 3. So that's for SECR reporting. And then ESOS, which is the Energy Saving Opportunity Scheme, slightly different. It's still 250 staff, but it's 44 million and 22 million. And again, you have to have two of those three. ESOS is slightly different. SECR, ESOS is more of an energy audit. So you have an audit of your building, and the auditor will provide you with, recommendations of things that you can do to reduce your energy usage. We're hoping that SECR and ESOS at some point would potentially become one standard. That would make sense.
Yeah.
To stop companies having to do multiple reporting.
Yeah, because it is overlap. It's the same information
Yeah,
presented different ways, isn't it?
absolutely.
So, in terms of again, back from the CEO perspective, if you're not being triggered by SECR or ESOS, or even if you are, if you do nothing, if you kind of ignore carbon, what's the risk? Is there a major risk there? Or what's the downside?
I think the main risk is that you're going to be left behind because lots of your competitors will be, and at some point you're going to have to. We again, you are seeing it's just going to become mandatory at some point. We don't know when. Obviously, government are currently doing a consultation about reporting requirements. So I think there's a first mover advantage for those businesses that are doing it. But also, frankly, at the heart of carbon reduction, there is also financial benefit. We've spoken a lot about this over the years that we've worked together. At the heart of reducing carbon is just being more efficient, and generally, if you are more efficient, generally leads to reducing, your costs. I'll give you a great example. We had a company that we work with who bring in uniform. They bring in sort of uniform from Asia. They then brand it and send it out to their customers. They were bringing it in, ripping open boxes, putting in their branded boxes, sending out to their customers. What they decided to do was use the boxes that it was coming in, and they wrote to their customers, say, look, the boxes you're going to get might be a bit tatty, they might not be our boxes. No customer complained, so they had a saving of not having to get rid of all the cardboard, and the saving of not having to buy it. And we're talking significant, it was in the thousands of pounds saving. They probably wouldn't have done that had they not been thinking about the carbon reduction. But actually, there's a financial benefit. Not using as much electricity, not using as much gas, car sharing, all of those things will also lead to a financial benefit, as well as there's obviously investment potentially. Yeah, if you want to do solar and things, that may not, but there are short-term things you can do that will generally lead to a financial benefit as well.
Yeah.
So there are lots of good business reasons for doing this, just to make your business stronger. That's the sort of way we really look at it.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, we always see it as a lens to apply to your business to find improvement. The best carbon example we've been involved with was actually an FM business, and they looked at the sort of fleet emissions, and they're measuring that, okay, how do we get the fleet emissions down? And they invested in some planning software, some route planning software, and they made the engineers more efficient. So the big saving was engineer utilization.
Right.
And
Okay.
it's massive saving to the bottom line.
Right. Yeah.
And they wouldn't have done it if they hadn't had a carbon reduction plan. They're going, oh, geez, we get a lot of emissions from fleet fuel. How do we get that down?
Right.
So, I mean, dead obvious, but it's just a different lens. It's not that the people there weren't smart enough to work it out. They're just in the day to day, and it's useful. So we've talked on some aspects of the measurement, but if someone hasn't done anything, where do they start?
So start basically. So the way carbon reporting is done is you split into three different scopes: scope 1, 2, and 3. And apologise if I'm telling everyone, but there may be people who don't. So scope 1 is basically the fuel that you burn. So it's the fuel in your company vehicles, it's the gas in your building, it's any fuel. If you're a construction business, you might put it in a generator. It's wood you burn if you've got a biomass boiler. And then so generally scope 1 is, I say relatively, and I say that advisedly, relatively straightforward to calculate, because most organizations will have data around that. Data is the biggest challenge around carbon emissions management, but most organizations will know the liters of fuel or the mileage in their vehicles. They'll know how much kilowatt hours of gas they've used. Therefore, you can get your scope 1 emissions by getting the activity, using the conversion factor, and knowing what your carbon is. And then scope 2 is broadly, it's electricity. So then you can work out electricity. So you could do a scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, as I say, relatively straightforwardly, understanding what that is. So start there, and then maybe add some of the other elements of scope 3 that are what I would consider to be, again, relatively easy. Just again, for people's knowledge, there are 15 different categories of scope 3, so it's quite big, it's quite wieldy, it's quite, scary initially for a lot of people. So take it one step at a time. We have a phrase, don't eat the whole elephant all in one, take it one chunk at a time. So scope 1, scope 2, and then elements of scope 3, maybe your waste, employee commuting through a survey, business travel you mentioned there, understanding how people are getting to. So to just start somewhere. And then again, part of a good carbon reduction plan is having ambition to improve methodology, data, but also, what you're measuring. So maybe that you measure scope 1 and 2 and 2 or 3 aspects of scope 3 in your first year, but with an ambition to, in year 2, measure other elements, and then by the end of year 3 have a full scope 3 management. And that again is tying in with what people like the NHS are asking, other bigger companies are asking. They're giving their suppliers timeframes of when they expect certain elements to be measured by, to give people time to do that. So start somewhere, basically,
Yeah.
is the key.
And I think something which is alien to CEOs used to financial accounts, which obviously heavily audited and the data quality is all very high. With carbon accounting from a starting perspective, it's slightly different. The greenhouse gas protocol that defines what you can measure and how you measure it allows you to estimate, which is a sort of alien concept for people. Hang on, I'm publishing estimates. How does that work?
Yeah, so the key to carbon reporting is transparency. It's about, we've got this number and this is how we got it. We took an estimate of a bill and we've used this conversion factor and this is the number we've got, and it may change in the future. So as long as you're transparent about what you've got and why, we reframe and restate numbers quite a lot, actually, to your point. Because also the other thing with carbon accounting, it isn't an exact science. There's lots of work going on in the background. You mentioned the greenhouse gas protocol. You've got the greenhouse gas protocol, and there's also an ISO standard. Literally last week, they've now confirmed that they're going to combine for their a single standard. So we're seeing a lot of what I call convergence in the carbon accounting industry. And again, for those who don't know, it's not a regulated industry. There aren't formal qualifications. That's all happening as well. So it's a very much a maturing industry. But absolutely, from an organizational point of view, have an estimate, but be really clear about why you've got to that point. And there are free carbon calculators you can use, like the SME Climate Hub's a really good example for smaller businesses, especially, that you can use. That will provide that information, and you can put that in. But yeah, transparency. And my other big takeaway is, don't try to make any promises that you're going to get to net zero by 2030. Again, it's a classic. 2030 is less than 200 working Mondays away, as I keep reminding everybody. People, we're not going to get to net zero by then, because the technology and the innovation and the grid won't have decarbonised. So, don't go too early with this, which again is typical business, isn't it? We want to go quicker and faster. This is a very, very different approach from an organisational point of view. It really is.
Yeah. So another thing we've already sinfully, apologies to the audience, used a load of acronyms. Hopefully we've explained what they are, but there are a whole heap more out there, and CEOs will bump into people going, well, is that SBTI aligned, or have you disclosed on CDP? How do they navigate this alphabet soup that's in the space? And once you lift the lid up, you just keep bumping into new acronyms.
Yeah, I feel people's pain, I have to say, because I understand that. And again, we take it for granted and try not to use acronyms where possible, but it is very difficult. So you just mentioned two there, SBTI, CDP. So they're different standards that are asking for slightly different things. One of the challenges, again, I'll be honest, for some organisations, is they're being asked to get their carbon accounts verified by the SBTI. So the SBTI is a verification body. Get them verified by the SBTI, or it might also be
it's science-based initiative is what it was.
Yeah, they've got CDP, which is a carbon disclosure project. ultimately they are sort of, you can go and get this a CDP aligned or SBTI. The challenge, of course, with that is they're all slightly different, ask slightly different questions. So I mentioned the word earlier, convergence with SECR and ESOS. It's one of the other things that we'd really like to see, is that what we think is that if you can have a sort of regulated, industry doing carbon accounting, and you get your carbon accounts done by a business that is verified, then all of those different bodies would accept that carbon report. And I think that's what that we're a bit of a chicken and egg at the moment, because you've got all these different organizations saying what they need, but you haven't got support to companies that is validated or verified. So that's really starting to take place. And you like us are members of the Carbon Accounting Alliance, which is trying to help that. But yeah, it's all of them generally want the same thing, frankly. It's your scope 1, it's your scope 2, it's an intensity metric, it's the commitments that you're making, but they're just asking for slightly different things. I think we've got a glossary on our website, so if anyone isn't sure, then go to that. Or I don't know, you may have the same on yours as well. They're always...
or just email us. We can always...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but it is a challenge. I see the odd new acronym every so often, and I'm where's that come from? Crikey, I don't know where it comes from.
And so again, back in with the CEO head on, and they're thinking, geez, should I give this to someone to do internally? Should I use consultants? I mean, all routes are valid, right? But what would your guidance be?
So I think you'd have to be a business probably of a certain size to give this as a full-time role, obviously businesses. But what I would suggest is, if you are an organization, you think there's somebody in your business that wants to develop or is interested, you'll probably find, then put it in someone's job description. But the one thing I think is absolutely a caveat is you've got to give people time to do it. What we quite often find is someone's given the role of getting the data within an organization, but it's added to their job. It's not, you probably see the same. It's not there's more time given to, they don't take something away, they just add it in. And of course, you don't want this to become a burden for someone. You want it to become something that people enjoy. But my advice would be, find someone in the organization who's keen on development, who's interested in sustainability, and then maybe try to do that. Because the other challenge is, where does it sit? That's the other question we get asked a lot. It can sit in accounts because it's numbers. We see it sit in operations. We sit in sale. We've almost seen it
in HR,
health and safety. So again, it depends on the size of your organisation and your structure as to where it sits. But if you've got someone doing it in your business, you've got to be able to give them the time and the support to be able to do it properly. I go back to a point I made earlier. This can't be about compliance. This has got to be about culture. This has got to be about, we want organizations to want to become a lower carbon business, because obviously morally it's the right thing to do, but also it makes a lot of sense. And the way to do that is to engage staff and create that culture. But again, you and I both know that culture comes from the top, and therefore you need the backup and the support from the CEO and the team to enable that person to do it. Yeah. So yeah,
and we would say, if you are appointing someone internally to do it, they kind of need a bit of reassurance. So either definitely in year 1, send them on a course,
yes,
where they can learn about it and get that background knowledge, or appoint a consultant to just give them the backup and the support, definitely for first year, so they get their head around it and feel confident. Because otherwise they put some figures out there and they're a bit
yeah, absolutely right? Yeah, and one of the things that we do, we sort of partner with them over the first 12 months to try to embed that knowledge, and then from year 2 onwards we probably take a slightly lighter touch, because they've got that knowledge built into the organization. And the green skills and the green transition is going to require a lot of understanding and knowledge. So there is a lot of opportunity for people to develop and learn. And it's interesting. Yeah, obviously we find interesting, but most people we work with do as well.
Yeah. It's interesting to nerds. Forgot to mention, if anybody's got questions, just there is a Q&A, so please do ping them up, and we'll try and get those to the end. But then getting back to, we touched on earlier some kind of cost saving opportunities. Are there any other examples or any other things that CEOs should be thinking, yeah, actually I can use this to drive this sort of benefit?
Yeah, I'm a great believer that behavior drives change. If you can say embed that culture within your organization, you've got everyone in your business, and it may sound, slightly dull, but it's true. Everyone in your business that is thinking more about the way they travel, that is thinking more about the energy they use, that is thinking more about do they need to buy as much, thinking of waste. You'll create this more efficient workforce that will lead to financial savings anyway, as well as it leading to carbon savings. So I think that culture, I talk a lot about, engaging people and getting people to do it. But also, if you have a way of, I liked your approach earlier on when you talked about a new lens to look through things. If you allow your team opportunities to give examples, the other thing that we try and do, and there's parts of like the Hearts Go Green and Grow, is collaborate with other organisations to share best practice.
Mm.
Great example of that. We talked about waste before, but there's something in your business that is potentially not going to be used. It may be useful for somebody else in your network to use that. And we see that one of our companies, a printing company, all of their offcuts and everything goes to a local college now, and the local college are creating art out of it. Whereas the college in the past would have had to buy that in, to make that. So there are savings from a financial point of view, but it's embedding this, say, culture of, we want to have a much more circular economy. We want to share. We want to, reduce the amount of energy we're using. So all of those things aggregated up lead to savings financially. And then, of course, there are the big things like, switching to solar, but that will obviously have an investment and a return on capital decision that can happen, but that may happen in a bit slightly longer term. But the shorter term behavioral changes you can make embed quite quickly that then have an impact.
Yeah, and it's funny, again, using that lens principle, when you ask people to focus on something because it's going to save carbon, we seem to get way more engagement than let's focus on this because it's going to save cost. It's perverse, but seems to be more motivational. But with the two big drivers we see, so productivity, if you can increase productivity and decrease waste, normally you're improving the bottom line. But you touched on some things might cost you a few pennies in the short term. What were the sort of pitfalls in terms of you launch into a carbon reduction plan and all of a sudden, hang on, where's the return from this?
Yeah, so when you have a carbon reduction plan, you put your actions in short, medium, and long term sort of thing. So the short term stuff's what I've been talking about, the sort of the engagement, the behaviour. Medium to long term will probably more be the capital. I guess one of the big challenges with that is, let's take excuse me, EVs for example. Do you know when especially in a commercial sense, if you want to get an EV van or something, you've got range, you've got pricing, you've got reliability. You might say, well, we want to do that in the next 5 years, but you don't know how the market's necessarily going to move. So some of it is going to be out of your control. The good thing about a carbon reduction plan is people don't look back and say, well, last year you said you were going to do this, and haven't you update? So to your point, it's not an audited set of accounts. You make sort of, ideas of what you think you can do. Quite a lot of the time, a lot of the wording is like when practical to do so, so we will switch when practical to do so. Carbon needs to become a consideration in organizational decision making, and it won't always win. And we've got to be okay. We've got to be comfortable with that, because we still need businesses to be sustainable and recruit. But if it is considered and you can justifiably say, we chose not to change our vehicle on this, on this cycle, because range, price, whatever. However, next replacement cycle we will, that's completely acceptable. And going back to my point about this being a 20-25 year plan, we're not used to dealing in those cycles from a business perspective, whereas this really is.
Yeah, very good. So in terms of businesses launching into carbon printing for the first time, or maybe they're off and running, what are the big mistakes you bump into when you come in to kind of run the show?
I think the biggest one I've already mentioned is people being too ambitious to say we want to get there by 2035 or whatever it is. So we've had a couple of instances where we've gone in with a board, to sort of set the strategy, and they've sort of made a commitment. Let's say they're working for the NHS. The NHS is 2045. They said, well, we're going to go quicker. Everyone always rounds it. No one says 2044. They always go to 2040. As you probably, you're with a smile there. You've seen that yourself. And it's by the end of that session, they'll understand why actually 2045 is the right date, not 2040. So I think that's the biggest pitfall at the moment is people overly committing to reduce because they don't really know how, but it feels a long time away, so we're gonna work hard at it. And then I think the other thing is people who maybe being too ambitious in what they measure initially. So again, we're trying to get the minutiae of every aspect of their business, which is very, very difficult. Another one of my favorite phrases is never let the perfect get in the way of the good with some of this stuff. You don't want someone spending hours looking over waste data, for example, every single week of a year when an average would be completely acceptable in that transparency. So it's probably getting the balance right between that.
Yeah, yeah. So another thing I'm sure you bump into it as well, is you go into an organization and they're very proud that they've been carbon neutral for a number of years, but when you dig in, actually it's carbon neutral for scope 1 and 2 and not their whole footprint. And we sort of enter greenwashing territory. And what other things are the watch out for greenwashing, would you say?
Yeah, I think you've just that use of that word carbon neutral is a good one, because say very few businesses are measuring all of their emissions, and obviously if they're making a claim, then that would be the case. I think the other thing is we're seeing a little bit of is carbon neutral on a product. So not even from so you've got product reporting, you've got project, you've got company
Company.
reporting, but you'll have a company saying this particular product is carbon neutral, but actually they've not measured all of the full life cycle of a business. So there's a bit of a risk. Again, I think it's a risk of people say it's a bit typical business as usual, wanting to go quicker, faster, better than the competition, and therefore making statements without really understanding some of the language to be used or where this is going over a period of time. The key is don't aim for any earlier than what you have to, 45, but you can say we aim to get there earlier if practical to do so. But
Yeah.
the reality is, because you've got to be relying on so many changes in
Third
industry
party.
and things like that. So that's the biggest issue. And I think a lot of people who greenwash in that sense, it's more through, I say naivety, it's more through not understanding what you're saying. So yeah, if you're not sure what to say, absolutely check.
Yeah, and I think another watch out is just to brief the sales and marketing teams, get them educated on what carbon is and what all the language is, just so that they don't go off on a tangent and all of a sudden you put something out accidentally, nearly.
Yeah, and there's something called the Green Claims Directive, which is about what people, but things like eco-friendly, there are certain phrases that people really shouldn't be, yeah, we get, be using necessarily, so it's better thinking through that language. That's a really good point about sales and marketing. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so just wrapping up, if you're a CEO and you haven't done anything yet, and you're thinking, geez, I ought to get started, what's the sort of minimum viable thing you could do, and what would the sort of resource investment internally be for that?
So yeah, I think it's absolutely getting those scope 1 and 2 emissions. So the fuel you burn, the energy that you buy, working those out for a 12-month corporate financial period. You'll need someone to be able to get that data, and then you'll need to have somebody that can run that through either say a free carbon calculator that are online, or getting that data and then working out what your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are. Then you've got something called your intensity metric. So you can divide your carbon by number of employees, for example, and that will tell you your carbon per person. And that will give you a starting point. And then, as I mentioned earlier, try to improve what you're measuring, scope 3 elements as you go through. So it will need some time of somebody. I go back to again the earlier point is ideally somebody who wants to do it. If you can get someone in your business who's interested, who wants to develop, maybe there's someone in their job, part of their PDP is that they want to develop new skills, because it's going to be a skill that every business is going to need over the next few years. So this is only going one way, no matter what people may think because of politics and everything going on. This is only going one way at the moment. So having those skills within your organization are really important. And then, yeah, if you're not sure, obviously there are businesses like ourselves that can support and help as well.
Yeah, and I'd say from a what are your risks perspective, it's if you're tendering for work with someone, tendering is part of your business cycle. You're likely to need a carbon reduction plan if you haven't already got one. And if you're in the supply chain of larger businesses, again, you're likely to need that plan because people like us are telling them you need to measure your scope 3 emissions, which includes your suppliers. and therefore the request kicks in. So I'll just jump to the questions and answers, see what we've got, if we've got anything going on there. Do we know any funding to support with carbon reduction?
So I'm based in Hertfordshire. I know there isn't anything currently, but there are, and some other councils that we work with, there can be, or growth hubs and people like that. So it's worth speaking to your, a local support. It's one of those things that's currently being debated at sort of national level from government about how we help more businesses do this, and so that's part of the sort of the Carbon Accounting Alliance type approach with government. But it may be at local, at local level. So it really depends where you are, worth, say, speaking to your growth hub or your local. There are some funding for training available. Training, you mentioned that earlier. So like sustainable business manager courses that can get funded at the moment in Hertfordshire, London, Norfolk and Suffolk, because we're tutors on that course, for example. And I think we will see that increasingly where there is funding available. There's also then potentially funding more for some of the capital investment. So you might get funding towards your solar investment or, so it's definitely worth speaking to your local council growth hub to see if there's anything available.
Yeah, absolutely echo that. And we get involved with some local authority schemes where they're running grant programs. The way it tends to work is local authorities apply to central government for a funding pot. It gets allocated out, and then they then decide what to do with it. So you just have to constantly watch the space. Really helpful to have a carbon reduction plan where it identifies we want to do this, which will create this amount of carbon saving, and then your grant application is ready to go when that situation arises. So that's quite useful.
Yeah.
Okay, we've done lots of good cost savings already. Have we missed a trick on reporting our carbon reduction? Very good question.
Possibly, I guess. But you can also report carbon avoided through things you've done. So you can, if you don't report that emissions because you're not doing it, you could say by choosing this, we have avoided X amount of carbon. So, for example, if you switch to solar, you'll know what solar is generating. Therefore, you'll know what electricity you're using, which would have come from the grid, which would have had a carbon account. There would have been carbon involved. But yeah, I mean, it's a good point to say that earlier you report, the better, because obviously you've got a higher number to start with and you can show your reduction. So another way of doing that is to say, by making these decisions, we have avoided, so you can use this word avoid around carbon. And I think that will increasingly become a viable way for organizations to talk about choices being made and the avoidance that creates. So because you can buy lower carbon. But yeah, no, it's unfortunately there is a reality to that question that the trick has probably been missed, if I'm honest.
Yeah. Though, if you are able to go back and get your original dates, you can pick an earlier baseline. So it's okay when you do your carbon reduction plan to say, okay, our baseline is 2020, if you had that core data for it. And therefore, you don't need to report the in-between years, but our current year is this, and we've achieved those savings by doing this. So within your carbon reduction plan, you do specify we've done these projects, and you can go into as much detail as you want in terms of what the savings are there. So there's always a way to reflect your good practice, but ideally you've got that baseline beforehand. Okay, so final question is, do you see any regulations coming for smaller businesses and SMEs?
So the government has to go back by the end of next month, by the end of October. There was a High Court ruling that said that the UK we're not in line to achieve our sort of, our regulated, under legislation, we have to reduce our emissions. And the government is coming back to talk about that. So we're going to wait and see what I keep calling new government, but this is the first time that the Labour administration has come back through this. So the government is going to come back, and part of that is also about required reporting. As I mentioned earlier, we're hoping that some of the standards get violated. Violated? That's not the right. Get amalgamated.
That's a different webinar.
Indeed, yeah. Get amalgamated. So we're hoping that happens. But I think it is likely that increasingly that threshold of 250 staff, I think those numbers will probably drop. But even if you don't have to do it from a regulation perspective, you're almost not going to be able to get any work from a company if you're not doing it. So it is coming. It's just whether the government decide to put in, regulation for all businesses, or whether the market drives it. But I think the market is probably more likely to drive the change than the regulation at the moment, from what we see, if I'm honest.
Yeah. And that's definitely been the case so far, hasn't it? I've
Yeah.
missed one question actually. So how does something like an ecology subscription, where you fund CO2 avoidance projects and tree planting projects, fit within your carbon reporting and reduction plan?
Okay. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. So that's where the net in net zero comes. So we've talked a lot about mitigation, so reduction, so taking actions to reduce your emissions, but there will be emissions involved in your business. And then one of the things that you can do as an organization is make a decision to invest in offsets, credits. There's different, and ecology is one such business where you can buy offsets. So let's say you're a company that you mentioned, let's just talk about scope 1 and 2. You've got 20 tons of emissions in your scope 1 and 2. You choose to buy from ecology 20 tons worth of offset projects, which therefore balances that 20 to zero. So you've got a net zero for scope 1 and 2, but we would again call it carbon neutral because of, to the point earlier. So you can do that. My only caveat to that is I think that's as a commercial decision more than necessarily an environmental, because companies are making that decision. It's not necessarily going to help you win anything necessarily. We definitely need investment in good quality, and I would absolutely advise, if you're going to buy any form of offset or get involved, make sure you are buying from reputable organizations, of which ecology, and there are others, is one. But lots of businesses probably need to think of that at the very end of the net zero pathway. But some organizations will make a commercial decision to do that still. Especially, I see that a lot in companies that have to fly. So there's no no carbon flying solution. They have to fly for their business, and they decide to offset those flight emissions through something like an ecology subscription. I think that's quite a nice solution to those sorts of things.
Yeah,
But yeah, that's where the net in net zero comes. It's the offsetting of the
yeah.
residual emissions eventually.
And what's important, I think, is within your carbon reduction plan, it's about the reduction. The offsetting piece is additional. So you just need to be really clear. We're not reducing by offsetting. We're eliminating what we can't. But offsetting is a good thing generally. It's a positive thing. It's a good thing to do as an organization. But the carbon reduction plan isn't a great home for it. You can probably link it to doing things on biodiversity. There's some social value benefits to it. So it's part of your wider sustainability piece. So yeah, with the carbon reduction plan, the big focus is reduce, and
Absolutely.
then the net bit is that longer term where then the offsets can come into play. And we do have a sustainable expert, Andy Harris, in Nature Broker, and actually, if people want
Oh yeah.
advice on that, then that's the place to go. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, David. Much appreciated. Sorry, we've gone a little bit over time, but if people want to get in touch with you, David, we will include a video link with this later. But quickly, contact details.
Yeah, so yeah, net zero doing so. My email is david@netzero.international. Pretty straightforward. Obviously, you can find us on the website, LinkedIn, etc. But yeah, no, been a great conversation as always, and hopefully everyone's found it useful.
I appreciate your time. Thank you very much, sir.
No worries. Great. Thanks, Nick. Speak
And
soon.
thanks everybody for joining.